I'm back with Stuart Sutton-Jones. He's a former BBC reporter who now runs the Canadian chapter of Latitude, which places recent high school graduates in volunteer positions around the globe. So, as I mentioned earlier, you spent many years living and reporting on Africa. Ghana seems to have drawn your heart. I mean, you lived there. You describe it as your second home. What is it about Ghana that attracted you?
I suppose when any young man from a developed country goes to a developing country at a particular time of their life, maybe it's that country that imprints itself on him.
And that's what you did. You went there to study. Right?
I went there as a graduate student in my early 20s. But for me, it's always the people. And Ghanaians are intensely welcoming, hospitable, jovial, musical, all these beneficial things. There's not the sense of social aggression you do get in some other countries, in Europe, in North America, and in Africa. So I always felt Ghana was a very welcoming place. And the more I stayed there, the more depth of friendship that I had or have, the more it has become genuinely my second home. I feel as familiar going back to Accra as when I go to my birth country, birth city of London, England. Mm-hmm. When I go there, you don't have to think about how to work the buses and the underground and the transit and all the way that things work. It's exactly the same when I go to Ghana. When I go to Ghana, I know I don't even have to think about anything.
Right. Well, Ghana's there on the west coast of the continent. Next to Ghana is Nigeria, mm-hmm. which is the opposite. I mean, Nigeria is a mess.
It's a dysfunctional.
It's a dysfunctional country,
and it's probably for the reason that it became rich with oil at a time of very early independence, and it has mismanaged those resources massively without any attention to its indigenous populations.
Well, as a good journalist, you've preempted my question. You knew exactly what I was going to ask, because mm-hmm. Ghana now has newly found oil as well. Mm-hmm. Do you foresee Ghana following in any of the footsteps of Nigeria in terms of the problems?
Well, the people who are making the decisions in Ghana now, most of whom I know directly, are perfectly aware of the pitfalls that can be before them, simply because of what has happened with Nigeria. Nigeria is only about 300 miles to the east, massive country, a quarter of the population of Africans are Nigerians, and it is a dysfunctional country, both economically and socially. In many ways, it is a false country, in that it is being glued together as spheres of influence, mm-hmm. Separated the French from the British. There are many constraints on Nigeria being a success. Ghana's aware of these, and in terms of the oil revenue, which is about to come to fruition, I think the oil will start flowing this year, 2010. They are aware of the pitfalls in terms of ecology. They're aware of the pitfalls on how the benefits have got to be distributed around the country so that people do not separate into the great haves and have-nots. Mm. And most importantly, Ghana is a thriving democracy. They just had a year ago their 5th successive presidential elections. And the ruling party was voted out of power with just a 30,000 majority. Right. Nobody died.
Peaceful, yeah.
It was totally peaceful. So they're aware that of what could go wrong, and they've got the right technocratic skills to make sure, and political skills to try and prevent it happening there. So I think the signs are positive.
Now, as we just said, there's a lot of oil mm-hmm. throughout the continent. There's all sorts of precious minerals. There's gold, there's diamonds. Sure. Lo and behold, China has shown up, as you mentioned. Mm-hmm. China's very interested in Zimbabwe, but throughout the continent, I think a lot of people don't realize how interested China is in the entire continent, and is trying to be influential in a lot of these countries, isn't it?
Oh, not just trying to be, is influential, but it's not a new thing. You can trace direct Chinese influence in Africa back to the 50s and 60s. And then China was becoming more of a world player, member of the Security Council, but most importantly, they were trying to revitalize their economy, and which we can see the benefits of that now, 50 years later. They play the long game. They formed alliances, both ideological but also economic ones, when they needed raw materials, they needed minerals, and they formed alliances with both political leaders in the countries that were newly to become independent or had become newly independent. And they started backing these countries. Zimbabwe is the obvious one, where the Chinese backed Mugabe, while the Russians backed his political opponent.
Right.
And of course, Mugabe succeeded, and therefore the Chinese are very close there. In Sudan, they have backed the ruling party there for about 40 years, whatever it is.
Are you saying they're backing? Some people have alleged that China has actually pulled the strings and been behind some coups in Africa. Do you think there's some truth to that?
I wouldn't be at all surprised, but that wouldn't be a new
certainly
thing.
the U.S. did that for many years during the Cold War.
And the Brits too. Absolutely. This wouldn't be a new thing in global politics. But they also, I think, if they do, it would be simply a reflection of their economic interests. Right from the 50s and 60s, what they were trying to do was gain raw materials at a cheap cost, and also separate themselves from Russia and isolate Russian influence, while at the same time trying to create a client state for the future. And I do mean that in the totally negative sense. They wanted to build genuine relationships. They put in lines of rail in Tanzania, while they built monuments to various political parties in the west of Africa. And they came with this, with a sort of ideological linkage to these left-wing, newly independent countries who were mostly from the left. Now you see that they are coming with the full package. They've got money to buy things. They're exporting massively to these new client markets with whom they've had relations for about 30 or 40 years. And that is a good thing and a bad thing. It has helped China, Chinese economy enormously. But in Africa, is having a surprisingly negative effect. South Africa, for example, the garment industry. In the 2005, I believe, there was a report that 80% of T-shirts imported into South Africa were made in China. 8 out of every 10. This killed the garment manufacturing within South Africa. In 3 years, from 2002 to 2005, 750,000 South Africans lost their jobs. As a result, South African manufacturing in the garment industry went through the floor, which meant they couldn't export under the new agreement they had with America to the American market, because they weren't producing them anymore. So it not only killed the American market, it killed local production, and everybody's importing Chinese. So it's great for China, lousy for South Africa.
Before we take a break, I want to ask you about your work, not just as a journalist, but also in the NGO world. You've worked, was it at UNICEF in Africa?
Yeah.
We had a guest on the show a while ago named Robert Calderisi, who wrote a book called Trouble with Africa. He worked in the NGO world for many years in Africa. And basically his contention is that aid money is, not only is it pointless, but is actually harmful in Africa in many cases, because it simply props up the troubled rulers and the problems, and in some cases magnifies the problems. I'm curious what you think about that.
I think there's a lot to that, and anybody honest in the aid industry will tell you the same. The problem isn't that aid solely holds up bad leaders. It is just not the solution to the problem. I was always impressed by a man called René Dumont, a French social economist, who said that small is beautiful. I mean, it's a phrase that's been turned into other ways. But basically, he did a social and economic analysis of Zambia, and basically he said any country like Zambia, which has got a falsely constructed economy built on extraction to feed overseas markets, which is basically copper, is going to fail at some point. What you need to do is have indigenous populations growing their food locally. It's the 100-mile diet writ large on the African continent. If that could be reconstructed, and the linkages to globalization, which is sadly the way the world is going, these linkages can be cut, then I'm afraid many economies in Africa are going to suffer the great inequities and stresses, because once something goes wrong, the whole country can go down the tube.
Okay, we have to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk about the work that Stuart Sutton-Jones is doing to try to give back by helping young people volunteer in countries throughout the world.